Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond, looking at every novel and film in release order, as well as doing little pit stops along the way to take a look at various other media that may have come out in between. And you join me at another of Fleming's short stories. It's a Fleming short story and the title hasn't yet been used for a Bond film, but unlike some of the others, I can kind of see why. Quantum of Solace was eventually used, and Risico, as I said in the previous video, is probably the only remaining one that I think could pass muster. Property of a Lady, maybe, and of course they were considering it for Dalton's third Bond film. 007 in New York, definitely not, and I do think Hildebrand Rarity lies at the bottom as well. Obviously, it gets its little nod in Spectre, but as a title, I just don't think it's punchy enough to carry a whole film. So while I do think it's one of the weakest titles, don't for a minute think that I'm writing it off as a story, because I happen to think it's one of the very best short stories in the whole James Bond series. And in fact, it's easily the best one in the For Your Eyes Only collection. From A View to a Kill, For Your Eyes Only and Risico are all either official operations or Bond still acting under instructions from M. Quantum of Solace is the outlier there because there's no villain, no love interest and no scheme to thwart. This has a blend, and even though there is a very obvious villain, this is no official mission. Bond finds himself in the thick of things quite organically, and it serves to give this short story collection quite a bit of variety, because this one positions its chess pieces in a way that differs from Bond gets his instructions from M. This one actually emerges as the most accomplished of the 5 stories. Let's imagine again that Bond TV series that Fleming was planning that never came to pass and ultimately resulted in this very short story collection. If that was going to be sort of like small-scale operations where, you know, Bond is given a case, this one would come along and feel very fresh. And so the same is true here on the page. This is different. So was Quantum of Solace, and I do still think that was a solid experiment in trying something different, but this one manages to still stand apart while still giving Bond agency in the plot. And it's still, through the exotic location and the loathsome villain, still manages to feel like a Bond adventure. Now sure, the villain here isn't out to destabilise governments or smuggle secrets or anything like that. He's a crooked businessman in a bit of a financial pickle who's willing to succeed by any means necessary. He has no problems with, you know, killing a rare species of fish and plenty of others alongside it. He is a prize arsehole who doesn't think twice about beating his wife. Now this might be below the pay grade of a secret agent like Bond, but Fleming treats Milton Crest with exactly the same contempt as any of his other villains. Intentions and plots be damned, he is as big a bastard as any of them. So while the ramifications for the world aren't anywhere near as large, Crest is so hateful that Bond having to be in his company and pretend employed to help him snag this rare fish is still really engaging. Milton Crest was obviously adapted along with his luxurious yacht for the film Licence to Kill. Now, if it weren't for the necessary subservience that the character has to Sanchez there, I'd say it's a pretty faithful adaptation. But without a boss here, Crest is the main guy, and there's also a superiority complex that comes with him that wasn't present in the film as played by Anthony Zerbe for obvious reasons. In that film, he is an employee of Sanchez. And because of the presence of Sanchez, even Crest's method of whipping his wife with the stingray's tail is given over to Sanchez, whereas obviously in the short story it originates as a Crest thing. The Crest in the film is, I think, an amazing character, and we'll get to talk more about him when the marathon reaches Licence to Kill, but I happen to think that the differences between the film Crest and the short story Crest are like I say, Anthony Zerbe does a very good job, and I do think that it is as faithful an adaptation of Milton Crest as you could get without fully adapting the plot. So to make him, like, he's not even the number 2 to Sanchez, is he? He's just like an underling. So if, as an underling to Sanchez, he obviously will not have the inflated ego that the character has on the page. So that there are differences. And I think because the characters are just as hateful, they're just as loathsome, they're just as slimy, they're just as slippery. But the character in the book, because he has nobody to report to, he's the top dog, that superiority complex and that inflated ego, I think, make him by degrees slightly more loathsome, and therefore I think as great as Anthony Zerbe is, I think the Crest of the book is the superior character. His nastiness like seeps off the page, and Fleming writes him so evocatively that he might well be one of the writer's most successful creations. Boorish and unpleasant when he begins insulting Bond's friend Fidel, who is along for the ride as well. Even like I bristle as well when I read that. Bond isn't let off the hook either. Crest sort of like needles at him at every single opportunity, lording it over him, whether that's being incredibly rich and flaunting his wealth, or just denigrating the British. It is a really strange reader who reads this short story and thinks that Crest comes across like a nice guy. Now, Fidel is a character we've not met before, but whom Bond has a prior relationship with, and I actually quite like that. Bond is a well-travelled man. He's obviously going to know a lot of people dotted about the globe. We may have been present when he first met Felix Leiter or Darko Karim or Quarrel, but that doesn't mean we can't just drop in on an already established friendship. And Fidel doesn't have a lot of time to make as indelible an impression as those other allies, but he's still a fun character regardless. And such is Bond's affection for him, and that comes across on the page, that we feel his anger at Crest for humiliating his friend. Crest's wife Liz is another well-drawn character and easily the strongest of all of the female leads in the For Your Eyes Only short story collection, and I think maybe even stronger than some of the heroines in some of the full novels. Her marriage to Crest is utterly miserable, and Fleming writes that incredibly well. Now, even if Fleming's strengths aren't necessarily with writing women as people, the marriage itself is described so well that Liz automatically gains our sympathy. Automatically. There is a subtlety there in that she's obviously desperately unhappy, and she kind of latches onto Bond as someone who could very possibly help her out of this situation, but none of that actually comes out of Liz's mouth. All of that is implied, and quite deftly. It's nicely observed, and even though this has the limited word count of a short story, Fleming doesn't waste any of them. So naturally, when Crest ends up dead in a pretty horrific way, it was either Fidel or Liz who did it. Both of them have motive, and Bond finds himself in the middle of a murder mystery. Now, as a big fan of murder mysteries, the idea of a James Bond one is absolutely wonderful to me. And that might be why I took to this story quite so much when I first read it over 25 years ago. But if Quantum of Solace was Fleming taking Bond out of his usual environment and plonking him down in another genre entirely, he doesn't quite do that again here. Now, Bond suspects both of his fellow travellers, but he's actually less interested in who did it and more interested in disposing of the body so that he himself is not implicated in a crime scene. And there is also a suggestion that he found Crest so detestable that he sort of a little bit wants to protect his fellow travellers, and I really like that. Obviously, it doesn't make him any less uneasy with the two fellow travellers, with Fidel and with Liz. Either one of them could be the murderer, and he still gives that due consideration. But because he sheds no tears over Crest being dead, it sort of becomes, like I say, secondary in his priorities. Bond can't sleep that night because Crest's snoring is keeping him awake, as well as is just pure contempt for the man. He is seething. So he hears the disturbance, discovers the body, disposes of it, cleans up the crime scene. When he goes back to his bed, he sleeps like a log. Now, touches like this don't only bring the story to life and make a virtue of Bond's presence there, as well as sort of giving him some really nice character moments. They also stop it from tipping over into being a James Bond finds himself in an Agatha Christie story. And I'm not saying there isn't any merit in that. I actually would read that, but I'm glad that Fleming resisted the urge to do that here. I know he copied Morm with Quantum of Solace. He could have copied Christie here, but he didn't. He's definitely doing it in his own voice, and this is most definitely, even though it's slightly different, a James Bond story. And what also makes it different from an Agatha Christie story is that the murderer isn't actually revealed. Although I do always finish this story with the impression that Bond suspects Liz over Fidel. Although I do know a lot of other Bond fans and some readers have got a vastly different interpretation from me. And if this were a real murder mystery, there'd fairly obviously be a solution, but Bond's priority is actually getting the body off the boat and covering up the crime. And by making that his objective, Fleming gives us the brief taste of a James Bond murder mystery without removing Bond from his genre entirely. And this is another reason why I think that this story is the one that gets the balance most right out of its fellows in this collection. A James Bond short story that doesn't compromise at the same time as giving us something new. And in my opinion, it's a huge success. Bond being able to sleep like a baby after throwing Crest's body overboard. Bond doesn't take Liz up on her offer to go with her because he's a little bit uneasy at the fact that she might have killed her husband, which is totally understandable. But it's fairly obvious, if it was her, why she did it. So I don't know, I do think it would have been like a neat ending for him to get the girl, but that is a minor quibble. The way it ends is still great. So with that, we've completed the For Your Eyes Only short story collection. So let's do a quick ranking of all of the stories within. Number 5, From a View to a Kill. Worth pointing out that I don't think this is bad by any means. This is a really consistent collection of stories. It's just that this one ends way too abruptly. It feels, more than any of the others, like Fleming was racing through adapting one of those unused TV plots with little effort put into fleshing it out. Still a great shot of miniature Bond action though. Number 4, For Your Eyes Only. This one has the edge on the last one because it feels like a complete story. And it's also adapted to prose far more strongly, I think, than From a View to a Kill. Number 3, Quantum of Solace. Unusual for this one to be higher than the previous two, but what I think works about this one is Fleming's commitment to the experiment. He really believes in it, and therefore I think he really sells it. Deceptive in what's going on beneath the surface, this one has far more going for it than first appears. Number 2, Risico. Even despite its short length, Risico feels like a full Bond story. More so than For Your Eyes Only. Far more rounded and complete than either that one or From a View to a Kill. This one is the one that most feels like a complete Bond adventure just in miniature. And number 1, the Hildebrand Rarity. So, why does this one come first? Well, if Risico feels most like a typical Bond adventure, you know, sent on an assignment, double cross, just in shorter form, then the Hildebrand Rarity is less in keeping with formula, but still a superior short story. The best short story so far, in fact, and as you can tell, this ranking is basically the order the stories appear in the collection chronologically. So for me, reading it, it just gets better and better and better. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this sojourn to the Seychelles, then you know how YouTube works. Please do let me know by hitting that like thumb and sharing it around. It'd be great to get as many Bond fans along for the Supermarathon ride as possible. And what do you think of this one? Is it a hit for the literary Bond, or is it just a little bit too domestic to be up there with his very best? Is Crest one of the most loathsome characters that Fleming ever created, or can he not hold a candle to some of the supervillains? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for some R&R with a hefty side order of legal troubles. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll see you at Shrublands.